Please welcome Michael Molkentin.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you to Linda as well and the staff of Mosman Library for very kindly hosting tonight's event, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. I'm really touched to see such a lovely turnout in a town that's very far away from mine. I'm from down just south of Wollongong, so it's really good to come up and see people turn out. Also, thank you very much to John Ulm, Charles Ulm's son, and it's a real treat for all of us, myself certainly included, to have him here tonight, to hear from him, and certainly hear some of his early memories of his father, and certainly memories of the people he was associated with. What I wanted to do though first, just briefly, is give you a bit of an insight into the book that I wrote, Flying the Southern Cross, a little bit of an insight into what I tried to do with that book, and indeed what I hopefully achieved with the end product. As Phil mentioned, one of my main research areas that I'm interested in, and I'm writing a PhD thesis on at the moment, is Australia's involvement in the First World War in the air. Now, if you're like most people, you may ask, well, did we even have aeroplanes back then? In fact, when I first broached this topic about 7 or 8 years ago at university in Wollongong, the lecturer I was speaking to said, oh, I didn't even know we had aeroplanes back then. And that was a history professor who said that to me. Not a military history professor, but a history professor nonetheless. So I knew at that point that this was a good topic because it was something maybe you didn't know so much about. In September 2010, my first book was published, Fire in the Sky, the Australian Flying Corps in the First World War. Most people do the thesis and then write the book. I did it back to front for some reason. And it came out in September 2010. And when it came out, it was reviewed in a few places, and one of the reviews was seen by the managing editor at the National Library of Australia. And at that very time, she was looking for someone to take on a project involving Charles Ulm's logbook of the 1928 Trans-Pacific flight. And she thought that I might be a good choice for an author. And when she contacted me and asked me, I've got to say, even though I just started the PhD, I jumped at the chance, because in a sense this allowed me to take the story beyond the armistice in 1918 and to follow some of these men home from the Great War and see how they turned the skills they'd learned while they were away for warfighting into something that would benefit Australia in the civil sphere, so certainly civil aviation, and so I saw that this was almost as a sequel to my first book, Fire in the Sky. Unlike that book though, which the publishers pretty much gave me carte blanche and said, do what you want with it, tell a good story, the library had a very definite idea about what they wanted, and this was an interesting challenge for an author, and certainly a relatively inexperienced author like myself. The library came to me and they said that this book was to be part of a series that they're doing to highlight, as they call them, treasures in their collections. So the idea is with this series that they take an item from their collection that's got some great significance to Australian history, and they use that item as the centrepiece for the book to tell the story. Okay, it's not the only source that the author uses, but it is the primary one. And what they also do is they reproduce pages from the document throughout the book, facsimile pages with transcriptions, and that kind of tells the story as well as the words of the historian who's writing it. In my case, it was Charles Ulm's logbook, a small brown notebook that he purchased probably on the way to taking off on the 31st of May 1928 in Oakland, California. And in it, he recorded his impressions of the 85 hours that they were in the air, he and Charles Kingsford Smith and their two American colleagues, Jim Warner and Harry Lyon. He recorded his impressions of the flight, and it is almost at times a minute-by-minute running commentary. And you can see it very much when I picked up the original documents. It has a real feel of authenticity about it. There's fingerprints, there's smudges. You can tell it's been wet and creased. When he's describing turbulence, he's doing it like this. It really is a document that has a striking sense of authenticity and immediacy about it. That said, I very quickly discovered that this would be a very challenging document to use, because although it had such a raw and sort of unedited sense about it, and this really kind of compelling voice about it, On the other hand, I very quickly discovered that this diary had been created for a very definite purpose. And that is that Charles Ulm and Charles Kingsford Smith, to help fund the flight, had actually signed a media exclusivity deal with a number of newspapers, notably in Sydney, The Sun, which was a daily afternoon newspaper at the time. They also had contracts with other papers around the world, such as the Los Angeles Examiner. And in exchange for a payment of money, in The Sun's case, £1,000, which was probably about 2 years of a GP's salary in that day and age, so a reasonably considerable amount of money. In exchange for that, at each of the flight stops, they stopped in Hawaii and then they stopped in Fiji and then flew on to Brisbane. At each of the stops, Ulm would take what he'd written in his logbook and he would cable it through to the newspaper editors and it would appear that afternoon. So in a sense, this was almost like CNN in 1928. It's real-time news reportage. And I've got to say, for us that might not sound so flash, but for Australians at the time who were generally removed from world events and used to reading things 2 or 3 days after, and also used to reading things in Sydney the same as the people in Melbourne were reading, the same as people in Brisbane, because they were all coming off Associated Press cables or other media outlet cables. To read this kind of I guess, immediate news reportage was quite remarkable. That, however, gave the log an interesting character because it really was revealed to me early on that this log was created for a purpose. And that as Ulm was sitting up there rocking around in the plane, he not only knew that people in Sydney would be reading what he wrote the next day, but I think he had a sense that we would be reading it many years into the future. And I think he wouldn't be surprised at the sort of book I've produced. And there is that sense that he is writing for posterity. The log also is not a perfect document. There's no such thing as a perfect historical document. They've all got their foibles. And there are some gaps in this one. For instance, when they get to Fiji, he was incredibly busy organising the next stage of the flight. It was a monumental task, logistically, to get the petrol and get the Southern Cross repaired and so on. And he writes nothing for the entire time that they're in Fiji. On the last night between Brisbane and Suva, they hit a monumental tropical storm, and it nearly crashed them. It nearly ended fatally. And he apologises to future readers of the log because for nearly 6 hours he writes nothing, because it took the strength of both of them to keep the aircraft airborne. So because of those two things, because this was created very much for a public audience, and because also there are those gaps, I had to use other evidence. And I certainly wanted to use those other sources to put the log into context, to sort of give it, I guess, to weave a tapestry around it and to help give it meaning and significance. And a few of the things that I used, the library's got a lot of, and I can see why they call them treasures, because they're really quite wonderful documents. One of the most exciting ones for me to use was the handwritten messages that were passed during the flight. Because of the engine noise, for the 85 hours they were in the air, the crew couldn't actually speak to each other, so they wrote notes on scraps of paper. After the flight, bundles of these were stashed away or given to mates as souvenirs. Some of them were even lost between the floorboards on Southern Cross and retrieved years later. Either way, the library has gathered up probably close to 100 of them. There's more of them at the State Library of New South Wales. And using those, I was able to eavesdrop in on the conversations. And I've got to say, they often gave a more candid version of events than the logbook did. And interestingly, they gave an insight into the fear, the danger at times. One of Ulm's main concerns with this flight was to emphasise how safe it was to a public who he was hoping to sell trips like this to one day. It was anything but safe, and I think the messages being written and passed to each other really give that sense. From the wireless set operated by American Jim Warner, there's also a log of radio messages that were at a few points in the flight received on both sides of the Pacific. And indeed in Sydney, radio stations were able to relay them live into listeners' lounge rooms. And I think that is one of the reasons why this flight resonated so much with the Australian public. It's one of the reasons why when Ulm and Kingsford Smith and their American companions arrived here on the 9th of June in Sydney at Mascot, which was then just a big open paddock, 200,000 people turned up, 1 in 6 of the city's residents at the time. And it's because they'd been listening to it on the radio, it's because they'd been reading Ulm's log in the newspaper, it's because they'd been doing those things that they had almost vicariously experienced the flight, and it was a natural end for them to go and see the conclusion of it just for themselves. The newspapers as well, of course, were a really key source for me. The Sun, obviously, being the exclusive outlet for the coverage. The Sun, though, was interesting I think, and it shed a bit of light onto the manner that this flight's been remembered. One thing I discovered very early on is that while Ulm is taking extracts from his logbook and cabling them to the Sun's editor is then actually changing the extracts, and that particularly what he's doing is he's changing the personal pronouns to make it sound as though Kingsford Smith is writing the log. Now, he even goes as far as changing the name and certainly makes it sound as though Ulm is not the author at all. That was corrected later in the flight, but for the first few days of the journey, Ulm and the Americans barely get a mention at all, which is quite ironic considering it's Ulm who's masterminded and he's absolutely in control of this whole media, I guess, coverage that is going on. But I think that's almost the start of Ulm's opaqueness, I guess. Oh, sorry, Ulm being covered up in the story, and Ulm sort of almost receding to the background while Kingsford Smith stepped to the front. And I might add that was much to Kingsford Smith's embarrassment. He said many times, even publicly and privately, that we know of, that he was embarrassed by the attention, and he felt that the others should have got their due as well. But not just the Sun, of course, there were the other newspapers, and some of the best things I got came out of the other newspapers, the competition, because of course their journalists were digging in the dirt. They were looking for a scoop. And one journalist in particular, Norman Ellison, found some very interesting things about some fractious relationships among the crew, particularly between Ulm and the Americans over business dealings and things that you could read about. I won't go into more detail here, but that was useful as well. Look, at another really fantastic source I think that I drew on immensely with the photographs. There's 120 photographs in the book, nearly all of them from the National Library's collection, and we selected them with great difficulty from several hundred photographs. This was an incredibly photographed and well-documented event. I've got to say that I think some of the best photographs come from people's cameras, certainly not press photographers, not stage photographers, but people holding up their box brownie above the crowd, and there's just this sense that you're almost there, and they're wonderful, and I've got to really commend the library for the job that they did with those photographs. Like the log though, there's some striking gaps in the photographic record. In fact, there is not one photograph that we could track down taken by the crew during the flight. Now, had Ulm had the ability to cable photographs as well as words, I'm sure it would have been very well photographed, but as it happens, he didn't. So there was almost no photo, and indeed even photographs of the Southern Cross in flight were very difficult. So we had to be a bit clever and a bit creative when it came to giving a sense of what it was like to be flying Southern Cross. Although, of course, we've always been honest when it's not an actual picture from that flight. Finally, just to give you an idea, taking all these sources, looking at this evidence, I think the narrative that I've created, I tell the story starting with Ulm and Kingsford Smith's birth, their early years, and I take the story through. Most of the book, of course, is the Trans-Pacific flight, and then there's a final chapter on their lives afterwards, which of course were both tragically cut short, 6 and 7 years respectively for Ulm and Kingsford Smith after the Trans-Pacific flight. But within that narrative, I think there's three big ideas that I was able to draw out and emphasise. The first one is the role that Charles Ulm played in this flight. Kingsford Smith, of course, went on to be a household name, as he still is today. He's on the $20 note. Charles Ulm really, after his death, receded into the background and has more or less, I think, been largely forgotten. That's a real shame because Ulm played not only a really important role in the Pacific flight. He certainly organised it. It was his business mind that got the whole thing off the ground and certainly launched his and Kingsford Smith's careers. I mean, Kingsford Smith was a magnificent pilot, and that really did come out. There's a lot of legend and myth about him, but it's clear from the records that he was a magnificent pilot, but he wasn't much good when it came to administration and business. And in fact, he was downright hopeless when it came to money. Ulm, on the other hand, wasn't, and I think it was a huge achievement of his to get the flight off the ground in the first place. Beyond that, though, I think Ulm's role as an aviation pioneer in Australia, I think, comes through in the book as well, though that's not something I only spend a chapter on their subsequent lives, but I hope I've done that justice. And I think that he needs a full book on his life. I think he needs a lengthy biography. There's a short one by Ellen Rogers, who was his assistant later on, Faith in Australia, it's called, and I do recommend it to you, wonderful book. But I think something much longer and much more up to date would be a great thing to see. The second big idea is that this flight signalled the dawn of modernity in Australia. And by that I mean this, I was so surprised by how many things I saw that were familiar in this flight. Real-time news reportage I've already mentioned, and the way that the media sort of fought over this, and when the media didn't get the exclusivity, they started digging for dirt, and it wasn't the only time this happened in Kingsford, Smith and Ulm's careers. Corporate advertising, I was amazed. I mean, the range of products that Kingsford, Smith and Ulm and Southern Cross were used to promote is staggering. Arnott's biscuits, Bond singlets, oil, petrol, holidays, you name it, they were used to promote it. Okay? Really quite incredible, and again, something that we're so familiar with today. And of course, also there's transport, the idea of transport. And I think the thing that really distinguished Ulm was his sense of vision. He saw the importance that air travel would one day have for Australia a good 2 decades before it actually came to fruition. And he was very much before his time. And like a lot of people who have that characteristic, I think he probably spent much of his life perpetually frustrated because the people around him just didn't get it. The third big idea that I hope to have really drawn out of this story was Australia and US relations. I haven't said a great deal about the Americans, but they played a key role in this flight as well. Ulm very much wanted this to be seen as an Australian achievement, and despite his best efforts to make it appear like that by managing the press coverage, he couldn't actually hide the fact that 2 of the crew members were Americans. Very, very important as well, the role they played, of course, but also the flight had been bankrolled by an American, G. Allen Hancock, an entrepreneur from California. In fact, the Australian government had withdrawn financial support, and Southern Cross was actually on the market waiting to be sold when he stepped in, bought the aircraft, and then gave it to Kingsford, Smith and Ulm as a gift, and then allowed them to fly it to Australia. Really quite a remarkable thing. I think this flight very much sparked off an important theme in the 20th century, and that's obviously our relationship with the US. At the time, most Australians were very suspicious of the Americans following the First World War. American culture was quite foreign to Australians, and it's interesting the response when the Pacific Flight arrived in Australia. They did a publicity tour of Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, and it's interesting that the Americans were one of the most popular, I guess, features of the tour. People wanted to see the Americans, people wanted to hear what they had to say. And I think one letter to the editor, I found sums it up nicely, where a man, he was Mr. John Wright from Lithgow wrote in, and he said that this flight had changed his perception of Americans, and he thought that maybe Australia and America could be friends after all. And of course, we went on with our shared interest in the Pacific, but this flight very obviously, I think, illustrated. I think that it was a very prescient comment. So anyway, I might get John, if you want to come and have a seat with me. I've got to say though, with all those sources, the source that I was most excited about coming across was this man here, John Ulm. And I hope he doesn't mind me describing him as a source.
A consequence. Bob Menzies, I and a couple of others were having a drink with him, and he was unveiling the Dargie portrait of Smithy and Ulm, which you might have seen. It's in the portrait gallery. And he said, "Oh, Ulm, any connection?" And I said to the great man, "I'm the only registered offspring," which gave him a great guffaw. I also met Menzies on another occasion when he was, thanks, is that okay? Offering us a drink in his, a few of us in his ante-room in the old Parliament House, and he said, "Oh, young man, I'll show you how to make a martini." And the staff brought, what's this got to do with aviation? Well, it's vital information for the sustenance of the human race. Hello, John. And the staff brought a jug, and they filled it. You couldn't have put another ice block in it. And Menzies took a new bottle of Gordon's gin, and he poured the whole bottle in. Then he took a bottle of Noe Prowl. I think he took the top off and passed it near the top, and then he poured himself a martini like that, and then he had another one. So I do Menzies martinis at home, but I warn people they must, one, surrender their car keys and prepare to repair to the guest room at least until first light. But there's a connection there, these wonderful connections, these sidebars, if you like. Charles Holmes' business manager was Beau Shield, and there was a par in one of the papers here, maybe it was column 8 several years ago, that Charles Holmes had given Beau Shield a bottle of Gordon's gin in Sydney, and he said, if we don't make it, drink it and toss it into the harbour, under the harbour bridge, which was then being built. So the connection, so I always use Gordon's gin, not only for Menzies, but for my father. So it's things you gather from history.
Indeed.
You missed that, right? Didn't you?
I did. I'm sorry. That didn't make the book, so there you go. But yeah, as I was saying, I mean, I was really quite. Yeah, it was a huge privilege to come and speak to you. I came and I spent the day with John and enjoyed his and Valda's hospitality.
She apologises for this. She got a bad throat tonight.
Oh, okay. Not a problem. Well, it was great to meet him when I came around, and we spent the day and we talked about all things Charles Ulm and aviation. And one of the things that I guess surprised me that you initially told me about that I was unaware of is the Ulm association with Mosman. And
yeah.
Maybe you could sort of, because that's something that isn't documented. That's why
I think I'm so glad Pages and Pages are doing this here, because Charles Ulm was born in Melbourne from a French father and an Australian mother, but quite early they came up here and they lived in, I think it was 27 Keston Avenue, just behind the school. I think it's still there. It's a rather solidly built duplex, alongside. So he went to the war from there. He enlisted, put his age up, and enlisted 1 month short of his 16th birthday. The war broke out in August, and this is September. They're all mad. And he probably convalesced there because he was wounded in Gallipoli and invalided out. He went in under the name of Jackson. So his war records, when he enlisted again under his own name, my mother told me that his father, who was a hate-the-Boche Frenchman, actually we're not French, we're Alsatians, disputed territory, which all the wars were about over the centuries. And his father, I'm quoting my mother, and as a reliable journalist, I'm quoting what she said, that he said, that his father said, well, you've still got all your limbs, what are you doing back here? So he re-enlisted and went as Jackson and as Ulm back into the Western Front, and he got shot up and invalided out from there.
Yeah, I mean, this is the incredible, I guess, again, this getting into this mindset from the past. I mean, he survives Gallipoli with a very dangerous wound, comes back to Sydney. His parents insist on his discharge as a minor, I understand.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, on his 8th birthday, his father, basically pushing him out that front gate again.
Yeah, well, you can go through the war records; they're all available, and you see this all done in copper plate pens and inks. All these changes, and so they've got to change all these papers from whatever his number was, Jackson, and really Ulm, bring records up to date. So he might well have convalesced here, because the military hospitals, of course, one was at George's Heights before the Repat Hospital was built at Concord. Well, in the only registered offspring bought some land down at Clifton Gardens with a marvellous view right across the harbour, and Valda and I built our house there just after we got married, and I think we moved into it in 1961, lived there for 40 years. So Mosman's the right place for the old. And our 5 reasonably successful children, I put a qualification of it, is my eldest son, who surprisingly is called Charles John. He's here tonight. Anyway, the 3 boys and the 2 girls went to Mosman High and did, they've done really quite well, as one would expect them to, of course.
Indeed. So after the war, I mean, another thing I think that, just staying on the theme of the Great War for a second, it is quite incredible when you get down to that level and look at the lives of individuals, how this conflict not only changed, the map of Europe and the geopolitical setup of the whole world, but it changes the lives of millions and millions of people. And it's because it's at war, isn't it, that Charles first comes to grips with the idea of aviation.
Yes, he was he wasn't a flyer, he was a ground person.
And he wanted to be a lawyer, didn't he, or a stockbroker?
Oh, a stockbroker, that may be apocryphal anyway. Bearing in mind that he went to the war at 16, he hadn't gone very far in the stock exchange, I wouldn't have thought. But clearly he had that sort of mind, as an executive mind, just to shortcut it. It was an executive mind, but he had a friend, maybe when he was convalescing after I think it was October or November 18, he was wounded, and he wangled a flight somewhere.
While he's in England, right? While he's recovering in England.
Yes, but they're only 100 miles, away from the front, and when they were wounded, they were taken to hospitals in England, and he's supposed to have done a flight there, unauthorised. Well, when you think of the sort of aeroplanes they had, you didn't really need much skills, because nobody had any flying skills. Although you would know that, we had by we, of course, our side, we had 24,000 aeroplanes at the end of the war. That's a lot of aeroplanes. They weren't quite as complicated as a Boeing with 320, 330, Airbus 330, isn't it? Or Boeing 747. But that's a lot of airplanes.
It is, yeah. And I mean the I guess
a lot of dead pilots too.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Though I guess at the end of the war he has an idea about aviation, and whereas Kingsford Smith's just addicted to flying, Ulm sees a business potential there, doesn't he? That's right. So he sees it's a way of making money, and he really comes back to Australia determined to, I mean, I guess marrying those two sort of sides, that interest in aviation that he's developed,
yes,
but also entrepreneurial.
He came, bearing in mind he was born in October 98, he was still a young man, very young. He was married, well, I was born in June 21, so allowing for the formalities, that takes you back, he was probably married in 20, when he was only, 21. And almost immediately he established aviation services. John, wasn't it? John Scott. He's the guy you have to meet over here. John Scott, he's an historian. Aviation historian. And in those days, everything was, all the weight was in Melbourne. Melbourne was the temporary capital that had been there for yonks. And aviation services, they were buying for peanuts, World War disposable aeroplanes, Avro 504Ks, I think. And he was John, I'm grateful to John Scott for digging this one out, about the details of the first regular flight planned to operate from Melbourne up to Bathurst. It so happened that in Bathurst, see, the distance. Australia's problems are essentially distance. And the people that happened to be a guy interested in aviation, I think, but he was a chemist. Percy, what was his name, John?
Moody. Moody?
Percy Moody, yes, out at Bathurst. So this highly detailed Ulm plan, all laid out, the publicity and what time it would leave and all this, and all planned. We're going to start a service from Melbourne to Bathurst. I don't know if the train was even out to Bathurst by then, maybe it was. But then it gets delayed, a spark plug doesn't work and the engine falls off. And he did that about 5 times until he got a reputation in the then aviation magazine. Well, Ulm's great fame is essentially failing to get companies going.
Yeah, he writes.
But he had this incredible vision and determination.
He did, yeah.
And capacity.
Yeah. There's he wrote a memoir on his way, quite tragically, on his last boat trip over to the United States. He wrote a memoir that was never published, didn't he? Manuscript, and it's in the National Library, and he says in that he started to feel at this time, of course he's recollecting, a decade later, but he's saying he remembered that he got the sense that at this time the greatest danger of a career in aviation was starving to death.
Starving to death, yeah.
So,
but he had the vision, and he saw the industry, and I think he says in one of his letters, or what he wrote is in the library, that aviation was more important to Australia than to any other country in the world, just because of the distance. But talk about the opposition that he had. For instance, later on, when they were getting a major airline going, the government wouldn't subsidise them if they flew in competition with the railways. So he was planning for the London to link up with the British and start the England-Australia-England air service. And the officials said, yes, we'll go along on that, but the aeroplane has got to stop at Cootamundra. Because as a train goes to Cootamundra, and we won't have it flying straight to Sydney, they've got to get off and get on it. And I've forgotten the name of the man. Fortunately, I've forgotten the name of the man. He might have been a state minister for transport, who said to my father at one stage, "Oh, this is just for you mad, rich young men flying machines, and no future in aviation." Well, the CTP Elm, and in the family we still call him the CTP. Often my wife says, "You're calling your father." Anyway, CTP blew rather a short fuse at that stage, but became more diplomatic later on, as Wackett says very clearly. That obit by Wackett. You see, Charles Arm's plan was we would build aeroplanes here and fly them. And of course we knew how to do it. And you probably know the name Wackett, Sir Lawrence Wackett later on. He was our essential. He's a World War I flyer, but he was essentially an aviation engineer, and he and Charles Arm were very, very, very close. And so had it, the ifs and ifs and ifs, but had it all come good, we would have had an aviation industry here. We would have, for his Pacific service, which he was going to start, except he didn't get to Honolulu, in 1934, they were going to use the new American Douglases made here under license. But the biggest influence against the development of Australian aviation was the British. And quite understandably, they were starting to put Imperial Airways around the world, and then in '34 the London-Melbourne Air Race, the British built a racing plane, Scott and Campbell Black, wasn't it? Mm. Scott and Campbell Black, John?
That's correct, yeah.
And they screamed out, and without any sleep, and they were just about dead when they got here.
The second aeroplane to arrive was a Dutch Douglas DC-2, which was the predecessor of the Douglas DC-3. It was air-conditioned and warm, and it came out, and the Dutch were already operating regularly down to Jakarta, which was then Batavia, but Australia, understandably, after all, the Bank of England and the British loans to us, you know, the British really had us by the whatever the British get you by, so you know, the visionaries, they understood that.
Yeah.
Understood that, but this is the geopolitical thing.
Yeah.
And you know, you can't escape that. Now, I could go on and on about the British loans, but Dick Casey, who Bruce sent Dick Casey to London, didn't he? Bruce wanted Prime Minister Bruce wanted a personal representative in London to keep him informed of what the thinking was. And almost and he wrote a book which I recommend to you. It's in a library here, I'm sure. It's My Dear PM, and it's Dick Casey's personal letters to Stanley Melbourne Bruce. And although they looked like Englishmen and spoke like Englishmen, and Stanley Melbourne Bruce wore spats for the very simple reason it kept his feet warm, and also he'd broken a foot in the war. I think Bruce had an MC from the First World War, but they were regarded all posh and what have you. They were very, very good Australians, but the British, we were in the hands of the British banks, understandably.
Kind of related to that point, I guess is the last thing I want to ask you about before I'll open it up for some questions. One of the most striking things that I remember from the day we spent together and talking to you was a document you pulled out that your family came across only relatively recently.
Oh, the last one.
Yes, and it's one of the tragic, I mean, Charles Ulm's life is full of these tragic ironies, and this one was the very final one, wasn't it? And had he made the flight that he was killed on, flying almost the same route via Hawaii back to Australia, there was an announcement, wasn't there, that was going to be made?
Oh yes. I'll go back a bit. Joe Lyons was the Prime Minister, and he was the first Prime Minister to get the aviation thing. Ulm had loaned him his aeroplane, the Faith in Australia, to fly around on election tours and what have you, and Joe Lyons saw, yes, aviation was the way. Now, his press secretary was Irvin Douglas, whom in my press days I knew, and Irvin Douglas, after the war, worked for Ezra Norton on the Mirror, and Ezra Norton's contribution to culture was to have a history page, and that was run, edited by Irvin Douglas every day. Now, Irvin Douglas commissioned John Ford, who became my number 2 later on in Qantas, to write the Charles Ulm story. And the reason that Irvin Douglas chose this, he published this history story on Charles Ulm, which enabled him then to publish a letter in the Mirror saying, I, Irvin Douglas, drafted for Joe Lyons a recommendation for Charles Ulm to be knighted on his arrival here. He would have arrived in sort of late December 34. Now, so I knew that, but I'd more or less forgotten about it. But as I'd started to get involved with the National Library and archives and what have you, and they're just wonderful. If you want something out of either of them, archives, they love you to ring them up and say, you know, so-and-so. So I rang up archives. Valda and I have just escaped emails and all that stuff. We're still telephone people. and snails, and I can expand on that. So I rang archives and I said, I believe my father was recommended for a knighthood in December 1934. And they said, yes, that would be Prime Minister to Governor General. The Governor General was Isaac's Brian, yes, we'll get back to you. Well, within 5 days, and I got it at home, and I put copies of it into the National Library file. Here's the recommendation by Joe Lyons. Now, the format is interesting. When you think then that all our affairs were handled by the Dominion's office in London, not by the Prime Minister's office, by the Dominion's office, and when you think of all the dominions that the Brits had, in the empire, from Tobago and Belize, as well as Canada and New Zealand and a few other largish ones. So as the year was approaching knighthood time, namely New Year's Day, there would be thousands of recommendations. One of them would be from King Umbopo's cousin somewhere in Africa. And so the format, all of which is done in hand, and down the left-hand column is the quota that the Dominion's office is allowing the Dominions. And we could have one KCMG, Knight Commander of Michael and George. We could have, I think it was from memory, 3 CMGs, and we could have 2 Knights Bachelor for each state. But as it was Melbourne's centenary, they allowed them another 4. And this is all written down beside the allocation, your ration, and so on. So Lyons, very late, wrote to Isaac saying, it had all gone to London, it was in the Dominion's office, thousands and thousands of recommendations, and he wrote to Isaacs, who was just round the corner, of course, from Yarralumla to the lodge, saying, and the language is interesting, from the Prime Minister to the then Governor General, and the Governor General was the contact with the British government, you see, saying, would he please defer a certain gentleman's name, which is there, and so, and insert instead Flight Lieutenant Charles Thomas Philippe, blah, 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 blah. And so when you look at the piece of paper, the guy's name deferred was Stewart, and it turned out he was the general manager of Fairfax newspapers. So whether he then got it, or whether he got the birthday honours, and then underneath it, it's own. But then that's crossed out defer PM, because my father didn't get here. So he was within a couple of weeks, because he would have arrived here at the end of December, and then he was to be knighted in the New Year's honours on January the 1st, when knighthood really meant something.
And as Lawrence Wackett said of him in his obituary, his country's gratitude came just too late, didn't it?
Yeah,
just too late. Look, I might, we're sort of running out of time, but I might open up if a couple of people have questions, they're interested in asking either John or myself.
The historians go on forever. The people with memory go even further, so beware. He managed to get out of my place in one day.
Yes.
You mentioned the popularity of Warner and Lyons, but when the aircraft landed, I think in Brisbane first, the aircraft taxied to the far part of the aerodrome, and Warner and Lyons were tossed out, and the aircraft taxied in. Any comment?
Yes, Ian Mackesy, I think, wrote that in his biography of Kingsford Smith, which I should say is superb. It's the best one by far. And there is a photograph that appeared a little bit ironically on the cover of The Sun, because The Sun was very diplomatic in its reporting, and The Sun didn't want any. The Sun very carefully avoided any of the kind of fractious things that went on between the crew members. But ironically, they put a picture on the front cover in which you can see these 2 tiny figures leading the Southern Cross, and it's in the book. And Ian Mackesy, I credit him for finding that. I do differ on one point with Ian, though, because Ian does believe that they were tossed out, that either Olm or Kingsford Smith had more or less turned around and told them to hit the pavement. I don't think that's actually the case. I came across an interview with John actually was involved in getting Harry Lyon and Jim Warner out in 1958 for the 30th anniversary to open.
With Qantas then.
Yes, yeah, and you flew them out, and they did a bunch of interviews while they were here with the press, and they actually spoke about leaving the aircraft, and they very much said that it was their. I mean, they were quite unequivocal in their statement that it was their choice, and in Harry Lyon's words, we'd had enough. We just wanted to go home, and they. I mean, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's about as close to the horse's mouth you're going to get. 30 years later, of course. So, again, that's like many aspects of this flight. There are a couple of ways we could read that, but my reading is that they did that, and it wasn't Ulm that chucked them out.
Charles Ulm did all the organising and the contracting and what have you. They didn't have any money, so they were very, very tight. And Charles had this legal mind. He had a contract, it was written down, and their contract that he drew with Warner and Lyon was that they were to finish at Fiji, because Smithy and Ulm reckoned, well, if we got to Fiji, we wouldn't need them, and they were hired hands. They weren't principal to the flight, and that's not putting them down. I mean, they're absolutely vital. But, you know, that their contract only got them to Fiji. And it was, of course, one of the opposition newspapers that said, no, they've got to come on, and Charles Ulm agreed to, and Smithy said, well, we better bring him on to Brisbane.
They actually, I mentioned briefly, but Charles Ulm really wanted this to be an Australian endeavour.
Yeah.
And he looked and looked and looked when they were in the United States. They were in America for nearly 10 months organising the flight, or 10 or 11 months. And some of the best, I think some of the best material, I reckon, on Charles Ulm, and no one from the library here, he's actually not at the NLA, it's at the State Library of New South Wales, at the Mitchell Library, and it's some material, it's particularly the correspondence that Ulm had during that period where he was trying to organise the flight, and in that you get this sense of desperation. He's looking for an Australian, and then he realises he's not going to find one. He approached Hubert Wilkins, the explorer, who they actually bought Southern Cross off. He had his own harebrained schemes that he was going on with, flying over the Arctic and so on. Then Ulm lowered the bar a bit, and he, I should say, raised the bar a bit, and he said he'd settle on someone who was British. Okay, so, and then he couldn't find a Britisher, as he put it. So he, you know, I think it was only with a few weeks to go, he hired Harry Lyon, and then Harry Lyon, you know, do you know a wireless operator? And they hired Warner, who was a friend of Harry Lyon's. So it was done very slapdash in there. I mean, it was fortunate though that they were both so splendid at their jobs. But yeah.
Harry Lyon was quite a character, but you know, in my Qantas days, I was with Qantas management as the publicity PR guy. The chief executive recruited me personally, and he said, you know, we're weak on the writing side. Well, no journalist could have a better brief than that. So come the 1958, the 30th anniversary, I sent one of my guys, John Ford, and a movie photographer over to go and find Warner and Lyon. And they did find them. And Warner was a bit down the drain then. He'd been on drugs, and he didn't have the strength of character that Harry Lyon did. So Harry Lyon did all the talking. And they were very, very good. And we did a movie of them. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
It's called, I gave it the title, A Flight into Yesterday, I think I gave it. And it's in the, you know, film, whatever it's called, in Canberra, about a 20-minute black and white film. But the things that emerged, little sidebars in that, I inherited my father's things, one of which was his flying helmet. Now, in the flying helmet, there are pads, big pads, against the noise. And in this particular one, it wasn't a, you know, sponge. It was a woman's blue powder puff. Now, how that came about, he missed this. Second edition. My guys bringing Warner and Lyon out in a modern aeroplane, a super constellation, at Honolulu and Fiji, they had met and arranged to meet people who had met Smithy and Ulm on their flight in 1928. Now, Charles Ulm had somehow lost his ear protection pad, and a woman gave him her blue powder puff, and that was in my flying helmet, which I wore in the aeroplane when Smithy kindly took me on the last flight, little Johnny age, what, 13 or 14 or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was his story anyway.
Yes, that's right. We've just, can we have one?
One
just
more
the young
question.
man over here had his hand up here.
What did they eat
On the flight, what did they eat? Well, they had, in Hawaii, there was a family they stayed with, that Harry Lyon had, he knew some people on the island because he'd been in the Navy, so he'd spent a bit of time at Pearl Harbor. And this family packed them, I think, about 80 sandwiches for the
Thermoses.
Yeah, and thermoses of coffee. I imagine the sandwiches would have been pretty rank by about the 21st hour. And there's one point, isn't there, where Ulm writes that in a radio message to the outside world, particularly to the media outlets, he writes something like, Smithy must be in love. I've had 3. He's not eating. I've had 3 to his 1 sandwiches so far. So they certainly are putting them away. And the other thing we know about food is that the coffee thermos, they ran out of water and they only had coffee, and it must have been open and it went rancid, didn't it? And at one point he writes in the log that he has a swig of coffee and it makes him quite ill. So you can imagine that. But look, it wasn't the food that they were craving. It was a cigarette. All 4 of them were.
Everybody smoked like that.
Yeah, and that's one of the thing that they mention over and over again, and it's hard for me to imagine because I'm not a smoker, but the thing they mention over and over again in their memoirs and in the log and so on is that they're just craving a cigarette. At one point, Ulm writes that he'd give a finger for a smoke. And in all the photographs in Hawaii, Brisbane, and
as soon as they stepped out of the aeroplane.
Right next to the plane, Kingsford Smith's first words on climbing out at Eagle Farm in Brisbane were "My kingdom for a smoke."
And then, of course, there are all other natural that it is normally considered a bit impolite to talk about. But Charles Ulm had bought or acquired the best equipment, navigation equipment, the drift recorder. Now, the Southern Cross door is only about this high, and Harry Lyon, to use the drift recorder, had to hold this door open with one knee and lean out over the sea and take the drifts, measure the drift, to check his navigation and so on. And when he was doing this, Smithy would throttle back, so the aeroplane was flying slower, not so much slipstream. And Harry Lyon said to me that he put his head out, it wasn't raining, and he got wet. And it was Charles Ulm in the starboard cockpit up the front using the slower airspeed to reduce ballast.
Well, on that note, we might continue the discussion informally upstairs with the wine.